Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. I am so thrilled to have you here because we are about to unpack some truly fascinating and honestly, often completely hidden psychological dynamics. Today, we're diving into some really compelling excerpts from our source documents about childhood roles. Specifically, we're going to explore the profound psychology of the kid who is always labeled the responsible one. We'll look at exactly where this role comes from, the invisible weight it carries, and how it dramatically shapes a person's entire adult life.
Let me ask you something right off the bat. Were you the kid who literally never caused any problems? You know, the one the adults were always saying was just so mature for their age? Well, if that sounds like you, I want you to know that this explainer is going to speak directly to your experience. For a lot of people, being the easy, responsible kid wasn't just some built-in personality trait, it was a deeply ingrained strategy. It's a role that gets a ton of applause from the outside world, but as we're about to see from the source material, it usually masks a very, very different internal reality.
Okay, let's just jump right in. Section 1. The myth of perfection. What adults missed. Think of this whole dynamic like a giant iceberg. Up top, above the water, which is basically what all the adults saw, you've got maturity, independence, and this total eagerness to help out. Looks like a perfectly adjusted kid, right? But man, underneath the surface, that is a massive hidden block of ice. That is what the kid was actually feeling. Just a crushing sense of pressure, a paralyzing fear of making even one tiny mistake. And ironically, feeling completely invisible. Because, when you're the kid who never needs anything, people just stop asking what you need. The upbeat praise they were getting on the outside completely contradicted this really quiet internal isolation.
So, how exactly does a kid end up carrying this massive iceberg around in the first place? That brings us to Section 2, Origins of the Responsible Child, Family Dynamics.
This source text actually points us straight to a really crucial clinical term here, and that's parentification. This is basically the psychological root of the responsible child archetype. It is a literal role reversal within the family system. The child is sort of implicitly forced to act as the parent, either to their actual parent or to their siblings. They end up taking on these heavy adult responsibilities, both emotional and practical, way before their developing brains are even ready for them. They're not just doing chores around the house, they're absorbing all the emotional shockwaves of the entire household. And there's this one quote from the text that just hits the nail on the head when it comes to that lived experience. It says, "The responsible child doesn't choose maturity, they adopt it as a survival mechanism to stabilize their environment." I mean, wow. Let that sink in for a second. Being the good kid wasn't some joyful, conscious choice, it was totally a tactical adaptation. The kid basically looked around at their chaotic or emotionally unavailable environment and subconsciously went, okay, if I'm perfect, if I just manage everyone's feelings right now, maybe things will be okay. They literally traded in their childhood for a sense of safety.
And you can really see how this survival mode plays out over a person's life. Look at age 8. Instead of, throwing a tantrum or asking for a hug, this kid is entirely managing their own emotions in isolation, just so they don't burden the adults. Fast forward to age 14, and they've leveled up to mediating full-blown family conflicts. They become the household therapist. Then boom, age 25, chronic burnout. Because these traits don't just magically disappear, they compound over time. You simply cannot run the emotional engine of a whole family system for 15 years without completely running out of gas.
So we've looked at the timeline, but what about the day-to-day? Let's shift to Section 3, the hidden psychological costs, the daily toll. When you actually break down where a responsible child's mental energy goes, the invisible load is just staggering. A massive 70% of their brain power is completely dedicated to anticipating other people's needs. They're constantly scanning the room, reading body language, trying to prevent a crisis before it even starts. Then, another 25% is spent just worrying about failing or dropping the ball. So that leaves what? A tiny, microscopic 5% of their mental energy for actually being a kid? Playing, exploring, just being carefree. The very essence of childhood is almost entirely squeezed out by anxiety and hypervigilance.
But of course, that kid eventually grows up. Section 4. How it affects adulthood. The psychological trap. We're going to look at the adult echo of these childhood patterns and how the very armor that protected them back then turns into a trap.
Now, one of the biggest ways this carries over is through something the text defines as hyper-independence. And I want to be super clear about this. This is not just about liking to do things yourself. This is a trauma response. The person actively avoids relying on anyone else because they learned incredibly early on that asking for help makes them a burden,
Or worse, that relying on people is inherently unsafe and just leads to disappointment. So they built this massive fortress of self-reliance. What looks like incredible strength to the outside world is actually deeply rooted in a fear of being vulnerable. And you can totally see how this hyper-independence bleeds into every single area of their adult life. It shows up as chronic burnout, like we saw in the timeline, but you also see intense people-pleasing because their whole sense of worth was built on keeping everyone else happy. Then there's emotional suppression. They literally don't know how to process their own feelings because they've spent a lifetime managing everyone else's. That naturally leads to having a really hard time trusting partners and constantly over-functioning in relationships. They become the rock for their friends, their coworkers, their partners, right up until they are just utterly and completely depleted. But the source material doesn't just leave us hanging with the problem. It offers some really actionable insights. Section 5, Breaking the Cycle, Shedding the Armor. So, the text gives us this really clear, structured procedure for unlearning all that hyper-independence, broken down into 3 steps. Step 1 is simply to acknowledge the hidden burden. You have to recognize that this over-responsibility is a trauma response, not some kind of personality flaw. Step 2 is to practice asking for small help. Think of it like exposure therapy. Ask a friend to hold a door. Ask a coworker to look over a simple email. You have to prove to your nervous system that asking for help doesn't end in catastrophe. And finally, step 3. Reclaim emotional vulnerability. Just start very slowly opening up about your internal world to people who are safe. It breaks the psychological recovery process down into something that actually feels practical and possible. And the absolute most crucial takeaway is captured so beautifully in this one sentence from the text. You don't have to earn your right to exist by being useful. I mean, that is the ultimate reframe, isn't it? For decades, the responsible child believed their utility was literally their only currency for love and safety. Breaking the cycle means accepting, deep down, that your worth is just inherent. It has absolutely nothing to do with how much you do, how perfectly you manage a situation, or how useful you are to everyone around you. So I want to leave you with this final thought as we wrap up today's explainer. Who are you when you stop managing everything for everyone else? If you strip away all the crisis management, all the people-pleasing, all the emotional mediation, what is actually left underneath? It's kind of a terrifying question, honestly, but it's also a profoundly beautiful one. It's a real invitation to figure out who you actually are outside of those heavy responsibilities you were unfairly handed as a kid. All right, thank you so much for joining me to explore this fascinating topic today. Take care of yourselves out there, and hey, remember to let someone else carry the load today, okay?